Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're talking about politics and how Catholics can participate in politics in the best way possible to actually achieve something and bring about a truly Catholic society in our future. And today I have with me Theo Howard of Vendee Radio. Welcome back to the show, Theo. How you doing?
Thank you, Connor. It's great to be back, and happy Feast of the Visitation.
Happy feast.
Second YouTube appearance today, so I'm feeling nicely warmed up.
What would you guys talk about over there?
Well, actually, a number of themes which I might offer a few elements here to your audience on plot lines, though it's a slightly different focus. We were talking about the Noahide laws and what's called political kayfabe, which is, for those who might not be familiar with it, what is a carnival term, basically fakery, and the fake nature of politics, certainly of electoral politics. But I think we're going to talk. We are going to think also about what constructive actions Catholics might take in order to go about our mission as laity to conform the temporal sphere to our Lord Jesus Christ.
Indeed. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can get messed up in this area. A lot of ways that are just very unproductive. So it's important that we all have sort of a good understanding of what we can do that actually works, and not to waste our time doing things that will basically get us nowhere. So regarding like England specifically, like what is it that would be best for Catholics to do in England?
Well, that's a very big question and an interesting one that you can imagine I spend a lot of my time thinking about. Just to say, actually, though, what initiated this conversation was your excellent discussion with Dr. John Rao. I'd highly recommend that to any viewers who haven't listened to it, in which you discussed Catholic counter-revolution broadly. Dr. Rao, I think, is one of the best academics that you Americans have. So I really look forward to hearing his comments and analysis. In your conversation, you talked about the British or English counter-revolutionary tradition. And that really got me thinking, and it resonated with so many of my own reflections that I really thought it was quite an opportune moment to reach out and to discuss that further. One thing, though, I think there's a good starting point maybe to frame our discussion would be to talk a little bit about Carlism.
Okay.
Because that was how I think you got into discussing with Dr. Rao, so we can sort of maybe follow that pattern. So Dr. Rao was talking about how he has many Carlist friends who are mutual friends of mine as well, Dr. Miguel Ayuso, for instance. And I had a friend, Don Luis Infante, who very sadly died earlier this year on the Feast of the Annunciation. And that was a real blow for counter-revolution and for the Carlist movement, since he was the head of the political secretariat there and a true warrior, true Catholic man. And the last time I saw him face to face was in Oviedo, his hometown, last year, actually, for the Feast of Santiago in July. And he showed me around his hometown. He's very proud to show me around. We saw the church where Francisco Franco was baptized, and we saw the cathedral and the various historic architecture. And then we went to the local Carlist circle, which Luis was very proud to show me. And I went with him to this place, and I thought this would be probably something quite modest, maybe a space they share. It was in a sort of unassuming office block, but within that office block was this dedicated space. It was a large, a small hall, you might say, with a library, with some very comfortable areas to sit and to smoke and to discuss. And there were all sorts of Carlist literature available and promotional materials. And I felt rather envious, to be honest, that this political movement, which is the oldest Catholic political movement that still survives with a clear lineage in the world, has the kind of institutional strength where they have a circle like this with actual institutional presence in every city in Spain and in many cities across the entire Hispanic world. And I got thinking, imagine if we got to a stage where every British city had a Jacobite circle like this.
Yes.
With a dedicated space that we could invite people to, that we could form people in, which is very important, and that we could actually network and grow from. Now, it's worth just thinking about Carlism first of all. How have they got? Why are they in this position, which I think we can say is better, in my opinion, than the Catholic political position in many other countries? Now, they would say, well, we're still very little impact on the political process and so on, but nevertheless, they're there. I think that's a really important thing. They're there, and even if we just maintain the flame for better times, that's still an achievement, I think. And if we're slowly growing, and this is going to be one of my major points, which is that the response to this aggressive Judeo-Masonic empire, this centralized power, in my opinion, is localism. The undoing of its strength will be in our own weakness. And I think that's what Our Lady alludes to in the Magnificat. And that's perhaps with a forthcoming Marian age, perhaps, potentially, the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. Maybe that's what we're being asked to consider, and to turn away from the allurements of falsehoods and half-truths that are offered to us within the political spectacle. So what I think, the Carlism has many advantages. What I really respect about it, and Dr. Rao talked about this as well, is how doctrinally coherent it is and philosophically pure, basically. Because Carlism, as Miguel Ayuso points out, is not an ideology. It's a lived tradition. And although it's been doctrinally refined over time, as it's been separated from a lived reality with the collapse of Catholic Spain, nevertheless, it's been maintained. And so if there are any Spanish or Hispanic Catholic listeners here who might think, what do they need to do? I think for them, the answer is very simple. It's just find your local Carlist circle and get involved and put your shoulder to the wheel there. The other great advantage of Carlism is that it has name recognition, right? So if you ask any Spanish person, maybe even Hispanic person, Carlismo, they know what it is. They know that means very Catholic, traditionalist, or organicist, subsidiarist, etc. All the key elements of Catholic social doctrine is there. It's royalist, Dios, Patria, Rey, Fueros. So the motto contains the full vision. Now, we don't have that in the Anglo sphere, and I think there's a number of reasons for that we can get into. So that's sort of something they have and we don't. And I think before we commit ourselves to certain actions, we need to orientate, we need to think, and we need to get our intentions right. And I think that it's easier for us in formerly Catholic countries, such as England, than it is in the United States, which is sadly this Masonic Frankenstein. But I still want to offer practical steps that Americans are actually engaged in. So is that helpful as a sort of way to frame this?
Yeah, that's a good basis. Now, or I think you're leaving out one key thing that Carlism has that we do not have. They have a leader. Like they
Right.
have someone who would become the king of Spain if they were ever to actually succeed. And would you say that's a part of why they have an ideological, or not ideological, a purity of philosophy?
Yes, I would entirely say agree with that. In fact, Miguel Ayuso talks about how legitimacy of blood and legitimacy of conduct of the royal line is like the seal on a bottle, like a wax seal, which maintains the purity of the essences therein. It embodies the tradition through a family. And of course, society is an agglomeration of families. So for the king, as the father of the fathers of the realm, for that line to be maintained, and very critically for him to be traditional. This is Don Enrique Sixto de Bourbon-Parma, who's led a very interesting life, sadly doesn't have any children, but he is seen as the standard bearer of tradition, or the regent. Some Carlists even recognize him as the king. He is totally anti-liberal, whereas, unfortunately, from almost every other royal line, we see compromise with liberalism. So that is a great strength. You're absolutely right. And he gave a very good interview, which I'd recommend people to look up, with a Spanish newspaper. I can't remember which one it was, but I think if you look up Enrique Sixto de Bourbon-Parma, an interview, you'll find that. And he just he is completely explicit and clear in condemning homosexual marriage, abortion, about how Spain needs to be publicly Catholic. So there's no compromise, and that's a real strength.
Yeah, and the Jacobites, like there's no, I mean, there, first of all, there's no Jacobite that is wanting to be king of England at the moment.
Right. Yes. So this, I think, then gets us onto the sort of heart of our discussion, or a major part of it, to do with the British Catholic action. So I'm a member of the Royal Stuart Society, and full disclosure, I am a member with the intent of Catholic integralist infiltration, to use that as a vehicle for a traditional political action.
I mean,
However,
the organization doesn't make any sense without that element, anyways.
well, to you and I, yes, but unfortunately, there's basically a sort of a kind of fragmented heart of the society, in that you've got people who are interested, who have historical interest in the House of Stuart, and it's a society of historical, antiquarianism. It's just of historical interest. And then you have those who see it as the surviving premier Jacobite organization, and therefore should be an institution for the promotion of traditional political thought. And those two elements, unfortunately, the sort of historical memorial side is more dominant in the society today. But
well, hold on. If the Royal Stuart Society was as you and I would like it to be, would they be the ones that would sort of start some sort of Jacobite circle type element across
they
England?
would seem to be the natural inheritors of that. You can see that in the Neo-Jacobite revival of the late 19th century, which our friend Charles Coulomb has spoken about quite a lot. And there's a new book on this, which is very interesting. I've not read, but Lord Ashburton was one of the main sponsors of that, and he was actually the Carlist agent in London. So there's a traditionalist connection there, and he was actually smuggling arms to Don Carlos VII, King Carlos VII, during the Third Carlist War, when the Carlists actually successfully created Europe's only counter-revolutionary state in the north of Spain, the area of Spain they controlled around Navarre. So
What was so where did Lord Ashburn, like, what's his history? What was he, like, a cat, like, a recusant?
I believe he was. Yes, I'm afraid I don't know the details. Be a very
Okay.
interesting kind of subject for a deep dive in a
Hmm.
future conversation. I think maybe after I've read that book on the Neo-Jacobite revival.
I might have to get it too.
Yeah, well, there's a big American connection as well. So I think it's a story that's important to Americans. Um, so so there's that connection with Carlism, and the White Rose Society was, or the Order of the White Rose, I think, something like that, was the main organization which survived until the First World War. And then, in the hysterical nationalist atmosphere of the First World War, the fact that the Jacobites recognized, although they didn't make a claim for, but they recognized the successor of the heir to the Jacobite claim, resting with the kings of Bavaria, the House of Wittelsbach at the time. In the Germanophobic atmosphere at the time, they dissolved, and it only got restarted after the First World War as the Royal Stuart Society. So that's that. So it's quite old, the Royal Stuart Society. I think 1926. So it's coming up to 100 years, but it should be so much more than an historical memorial society. And I think maybe changing the name would reflect that. One of the things I love about Carlism is their choice of the actual name of the political organization was the Traditionalist Communion, or the
Yes.
Traditional Communion. And they explicitly, and they ran for elections as the Traditional Communion, not as the Carlist Party, because Carlism is against political parties, as I think we all should be.
I didn't think they were running candidates.
So this is in local
Okay.
elections recently, but I'm thinking further back in the period leading up to the Spanish Civil War
Yes, that
in
was,
the
yes.
1930s, when
Okay.
Don Manuel Falconde, who was an organizational genius, really revived and grew the Traditional Communion, to become a really powerful Catholic political force in Spain, which then saved Spain from communism, and in a certain sense kept Spain Catholic for 37 years. So Carlism had a great impact, although sadly it's been said that they won the war but lost the peace, because Franco was actually really not as Catholic as people like to make out. Preferable to the alternative, of course, but not representative of a full restoration of a Catholic social order, as Carlism stood for.
Yeah.
So the Royal Stuart Society today, continuing that identification of the Jacobite lineage with the House of Wittelsbach, who are now no longer the kings of Bavaria, of course. The claim, if it were to be revived, lies with Franz, Duke of Bavaria, who is a homosexual
Yeah.
degenerate. So
He's almost dead.
I'm not going to be transferring my allegiance anytime soon.
Well, he is
If
almost dead. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of a the waiting for the boomers to give over to future generations.
Yes, it
Seems
is
to be a
very
common
sad. It's
theme.
very sad.
So who knows in the future if a more worthy heir came forward, then that might be quite interesting. But that's still, we can still do a lot in the meantime, and it's not just about the heir, but it's also about trying to understand what is Jacobitism, what is the actual political doctrine. Now, the political doctrine is nowhere near as developed as Carlism, and I think it has several problems, which have really given me pause for thought. So we can get into discussing those.
Yeah, and I mean, the line will go to the Liechtensteins, which I think have, maybe a little more optimism. But we don't, as you said, we don't need, or you don't need a Jacobite ruler or a Jacobite leader at the moment. I mean, especially throughout the whole history of Jacobitism, a direct ruler or direct leader isn't necessary, especially because there's so much to be done that would be leading up to any possible restoration. We're nowhere near any of that in England at the moment. If you guys were near that and you still don't have a leader, I think that, you can obviously see that then there's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That's the dynamic I think that I'm really focusing on here, the importance of grassroots and within God's providential order being deserving is maybe the wrong word, but certainly in actually praying and striving to merit a better political situation. Following our Lord's words, seek first the kingdom of heaven and its justice, and all these other things will be given unto you. In seeking, the Christendom was all these other things, the glories of Christendom. And the central problem with Catholic political engagement today, in my opinion, is the fixation on all the other things rather than the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, and looking to save and put at the heart of one's politics the fruits of Christendom rather than looking to recover the roots of Christendom. And I don't think God's going to reward us with more success until we break out of that. And I think to break out of it, things are going to have to get a lot worse.
Yes, definitely. I think things are definitely getting worse as we speak. And in some ways, I think almost, in America, at least, I actually think Biden might be the best president we could possibly have right now.
Yes, maybe it's the same with Francis as well, in a mysterious sense.
Yeah, if things seem to be going well, nobody's going to be looking for anything else.
Yes.
And if you're stuck in filth, basically, you're not going to pull yourself out of that filth if, everyone's happy in the filth.
Yeah, I think this is the major theme that I explored a little in the Dr. Deep State podcast, which is, I think, should be at the heart of a political vision, a political platform, which is political repentance. That, like the hardened sinner gazing at the slop for the pigs, we need to reach that rock bottom where we then turn back towards the Father and his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's starting to happen, of course, at the level of souls. And the city is merely a multitude of souls, souls living in families, living in households. So to the extent that it's beginning to occur within the traditional Catholic world, I think, as Alan Phimister says, we're beginning to see the very, very earliest buds of spring. But there's a long way to go.
Yeah. If you were to get more people to join the Royal Stuart Society that were Catholic and politically minded in that way, would that change the organization, or does it not change because it's a more sort of hierarchical organization?
I am not too aware of the hierarchy in the organization of with regard to decision making and orientation, but it is quite traditionally led. I mean, the patron is the Duke of St Albans, and yes, I think it's in under the control, more establishment aligned older figures who, through sort of years of dedication, have risen to the top of the committee and so on. So I think that is quite going. Would be difficult to to pursue an entryist strategy. I mean, I still think that it's worth Catholics doing, but as I said, I'm now much more hesitant about rallying to the standard of Jacobitism. Okay. I think that that's necessary, but not sufficient. I think that Jacobitism should be within a Catholic English political vision, but it shouldn't be the heart of it. And I think there are two reasons for that.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The first of them is that Jacobitism is not, unlike Carlism, doctrinally pure. It doesn't explicitly advocate the social reign of Christ. In some ways it does, but the House of Stuart made sort of fatal compromises with the Anglican establishment at the time, which involves accepting the progress of the revolution in Britain, particularly the Protestant Revolution. And this is something that Edmund Burke, of course, who is for many Catholics a great celebrated figure, but he talks about how, in talking about how bad the French Revolution is, he talks about how wonderful the so-called glorious revolution was, and also about the dispossession of the commons, which was another very important early revolutionary act, which harmed the social fabric hugely. So because Jacobitism isn't explicitly Catholic, in other words, it's sort of, it is and it isn't. That's an issue, and I know there's a sort of spectrum in a relationship between Jacobitism and Toryism, or high Toryism, and a lot of Catholics I know sort of rally to the high Tory tradition, but I think that's very problematic. For instance, during the debates around Catholic emancipation in the early 19th century, before it was finally passed in 1829, the biggest opponents of Catholic emancipation were the high Tories, who stood most of all for the Anglican integralist settlement. And the biggest supporters of Catholic emancipation were the Whigs, who normally would be our biggest enemies. But in this case, that liberalism was in our favor. So it's just not as clear cut as people, and this came across in your discussion with Dr. Brown. I think Dr. Brown said it's fun to play with these ideas. I like the way he put that, but it's hard to make it a serious sort of central banner in the way that Carlism can be for Spanish people and Hispanics, because of these incongruences, because of these inconsistencies, and because of this lack of total alignment with the social doctrine of the church. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I think a Catholic political vision has to contain Jacobitism, has to recover and revive the best parts of it. For instance, the Jacobite vision of a British monarchy, a single monarchy, but with separate national constitutions and identities, which I think would resolve, is the natural resolution to the problems of Scottish nationalism and Welsh and all these the nationalisms of the home nations, and Irish nationalism, of course.
Wouldn't that be still 2 kingdoms or 3 kingdoms or however?
Well, yeah, it would be 3 kingdoms historically, and the Principality of Wales, not to be forgotten.
Yes.
And yes, they would be completely separate kingdoms with their own parliaments, but with a shared monarch, and that would be Catholic subsidiarity in action for the British Isles.
Would the parliament be much more limited?
Oh yes, yes. Yeah. It wouldn't be constantly in session like it is now, for example. It would be convened at the king's pleasure to raise supply, to raise taxation, and that's it.
I mean,
so all of the functions of the welfare state and everything that would all be gone. That would all be carried out by the church.
A lawmaking body doesn't make sense from a meeting consistently. Doesn't make sense from a sort of organic perspective or from a natural law perspective. There are just the laws that are naturally need to be followed, and things people need to do, and then only in emergencies, pretty much, or if something were to arise, then that's the only reason why usually legislatures would even be needed to be called.
Exactly, because the people are Christian, and they're going, and you have Christian peace in the realm through the king's peace, and there is an organic order which is self-constituting and self-regarding, governed at various levels of competency, and the centrality of contemplative life in recognizing and believing God as absolute being, and us as human beings rather than human doings, that we don't need this frenetic legal positivism, which is a product of early modernity, when basically European man started turning away from God and started listening to the devil, that that man can be as God through his own efforts, and of course that those efforts are reflected in legal statutes.
What's a political idea or philosophy, that is close to England, uh, that that Catholics can grab onto? Since, as you said, the first thing should not be Jacobitism; it should be a part of it, but not the first thing. Outside of, obviously, what the faith prescribes, directly, what should be the next thing to grab onto?
Well, just finally, the second reason why
Oh,
I've distanced from that Jacobite label is, or identity, is the Stuarts, the House of Stuart, the Stuart monarchs' flirtation with revolution, with Kabbalah, which is something I've only really sort of read about recently, but very sadly, the monarchs, Charles I, Charles II, would host these Kabbalistic masques, these balls with all these occult themes and esoteric themes, which was depressingly common at the time in the courts of Europe, sort of, again, following the neo-pagan Renaissance and the sort of the seeding of and the infiltration of Jewish Gnosticism into Christian politics. But the fact that they did that they had this flirtation, I think maybe is why God allowed for them to be overthrown and for that throne to be usurped. So that's a little detail, but I think, or an important detail, but I think what that tells us is that we need to take what's best from the Jacobite tradition, but acknowledge its failures and shortcomings, and resolve that we're going to do better. We're not just going to undo the revolution of the Puritans in under Cromwell. We're going to seek to undo the source of all England's ills, the Protestant Revolution. And that great evil needs to be repented of and atoned for. And so that must be at the heart of the political vision. So to go back to Toryism, Jacobitism, they repudiate at their best. They repudiate Marxism. They repudiate even liberalism, but they don't repudiate Protestantism fully. The three great enemies of the church, the three great solvents of Christian civilization. So we need to repudiate all three. So as for how we could center that identity, because again, come back to the Carlism, it has such good name recognition that it's an extant tradition which people know about. They might reject it completely, they might dislike it. They know what it means, and it has that connection right the way back, unbroken, to Catholic Spain, which is Spain's glory and Spain's identity, true identity in Spain's past. So it's there. But we don't have that because we've had that rupture in the tradition, the counter-revolutionary tradition.
It just makes me think of Lord of the Rings, the line of the kings broken.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's really, that's what makes it so difficult. And I would say even in France, for example, Bourbon legitimism, they're in a better position than English counter-revolutionary Catholics. but not quite as good as the Carlists, because unfortunately Bourbon legitimism, I believe, is somewhat infected with the absolutism, or it can be infected by with the absolutism and the sort of what Charles Maurras called, I think, integral positivism of sort of later French monarchist movements, basically as a result of Cartesianism, whereas Carlism always remained Thomistically pure. So these are, they're just kind of getting more in detail there, but we've got more issues to unravel here in the English counter-revolutionary tradition. So what could we rally to? Well, we have to look back at the Middle Ages. We have to look back at Merry England, and I've been sort of toying with ideas like the Merry England Party, or the different titles, different ideas, and then when you really think, what is England's greatest title? It's the Dowry of Mary. But sadly, these titles getting given to people, I think most people just wouldn't understand. That's not connecting really. Whereas
these are older, much older.
Exactly. So the revolutionary sort of amnesia process has really done a number on English men, so that they just don't connect with these things. One idea, so I don't have the answer, but what one pillar of our counter-revolutionary platform that I think we should really emphasize is the common law. In my opinion, this is the greatest, most precious inheritance of England's Catholic past that we have, and actually that you have in the United States. And it's something that we almost take for granted. It's quite subtle, and it's been horribly eroded and corrupted, but it's still there. And I think that's something that still resonates with the English soul. So I know the Polish party called the Law and Justice Party, with the Common Law Party, but something that just connects in people's mind that this is the Magna Carta Party, something that the Constitution, the venerable English Constitution, the Catholic Constitution, that might be a sort of to do when again with regards to kind of image and messaging. That might be something to focus on.
Who do you think is the best Catholic English king? Who do you think is the most Edward the Confessor?
Well, he's the only saint, so one would have to say yes. Supernaturally speaking, nevertheless, the fact that he was so holy that he had a Josephite marriage, meaning that he bequeathed England with a really horrible dynastic issue, was a problem. Although the Norman invasion, I don't think was as disastrous as some English patriots like to imagine. Nor do I think it was as wonderful as Hilaire Belloc makes out.
So you're somewhere between Tolkien and Belloc.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. So yeah, I think that Edward the Confessor would have to be, but other than Edward the Confessor, I'd say the only king with the epithet the Great, Alfred the Great.
So not the Lionheart.
Oh, he's up there, yeah, in the top 10. He's definitely up there, without a shadow of a doubt. But Richard the Lionheart was a great warrior and a great symbol, which is the king's primary role. And he participated in England's projection of herself beyond herself, in actually affecting the destiny of Christendom as a whole, which is glorious. But Alfred, I think, in terms of establishing the deep bone structure of England, was unparalleled among the English monarchs. And although he wasn't monarch of all England, though, of course, so he might not be able to be a viable candidate.
Yes.
But I really think that the sort of hagiography, and in fact, he has been venerated as a saint. The sort of Victorian hagiography of Alfred, I think, is entirely justified. And I think he really did embody this core principle, to go back to it, of seeking first the kingdom of heaven, and all these other things will be given unto you. And that's what he did in seeking to convert the Danes rather than just defeat them. He prioritized converting them, and in doing that, he was rewarded as the founder of well, as the sort of the re-established founder of the House of Wessex, and the man who established England's law again, who established England's burghs, her shires, all of these fundamental political forms which survive with us to this day.
There's also Saint Edmund, right? Too.
Yes, exactly. Yes, Saint Edmund the Martyr. I always get these two confused. There's Saint Edward of East Anglia. I'm gonna have to check.
I think it's the martyr, because he's the one that got his head got taken off, and then wolves brought his head to his people or something like that.
Right. So there's Edmund the Martyr, who was killed by Vikings, I think.
Yes.
With arrows. And then you're right. There's Edward the Martyr, who was king of the English. Yes, and you're quite right. Was killed amidst the investiture the investiture controversies, and the sort of power struggle that went on there. So yeah, I need to read more about him. Alan Phimister gave a great interview, or shared a lot of very interesting details on my channel, Catholic History of England, it's called. So I need to re-listen to that.
I do think a Lionheart party. Now that would, like, I just think that would, like, the imagery. You could also use the St. George's cross there, because that's really where St. George's cross comes from, is the Crusades and Richard the Lionheart. I just think that would be cool. Like, could quite get some people interested.
Yes, yeah, you're right. It does have that instant recognition and that appeal to the English masculine spirit, whatever is left of that. And that, I think, is because so much politics is just getting that recognition, that you're getting attention. So yes, perhaps. But it needs to deliver front and center the message that the Catholic faith built England. Only the Catholic faith can restore England.
Well, yeah. Well, with I think with Alfred and even Edward the Confessor, though, I think their arguments are really pathetic. But I think nobody can argue that, like, Richard the Lionheart wasn't a Catholic.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think this is what Richard the Lionheart would say if he could see the state of England today. So yeah, that seems to be that would, I think, is quite an interesting idea.
Though they will come back at you that, oh no, he was more French.
Yes, yeah. That's the again, to go back to the Norman conquest, the sort of the hybrid or the mongrel nature of the English being both a Latin and Germanic people, but that the fact is they were all Catholic. That's the important thing. So people, because they live such godless lives, in de-emphasizing religion, they just don't see that. So these other natural differences become more pronounced when they fail to recognize the supernatural unity.
Indeed.
So I had an interesting conversation with Father Thomas Crean, who you might have heard of, the author of Integralism.
Yeah, I've interviewed him actually on the channel once.
Oh, terrific! Well, it was quite interesting actually. We were in a pub with a number of other English laymen, and we were doing the usual thing of slightly wallowing in the ills that afflict our nation and indeed the West as a whole. And Father Crean said something very interesting. He said, "Why don't you start a party, a political party, and why don't you have as a policy, we are going to institute the death penalty for doctors that mutilate children as part of these horrendous, abominable trans operations." And his reasoning was very interesting. He said that in recognizing that politics today is all about public perception, this and sort of media attention, this headline grabbing policy will be so stark compared to everything else that's out there, although of course entirely justified, that you will attract media attention. And if you have a strong enough frame so that when the media question you and harangue you about this, and you say, yeah, we're going to have the death penalty for all doctors that do that, and you do it completely unapologetically, which of course is the big problem with so-called conservatives, that they fall into the enemy's frame and they look weak for that reason. They apologize for their conservatism because it's not grounded usually in faith, in true religion. So he said, yes, if you have this policy and you put it on flyers, this is what we're going to enact, then that's a policy that actually deep down maybe a majority of people will agree with. If you said death penalty for abortionist doctors, which of course would also be entirely justified, then maybe the majority at the moment wouldn't agree with that. But with the kids trans things, it's such a, so I thought that was quite impressive because he's kind of very politically astute with like where this is something that Dr. Plinio Correa de Oliveira talks about quite a lot, which is that the revolution is like a bicycle and that it needs to be always moving forward. If it stops, then it falls down. So the revolution will always, at the moment it's on trans, and then God knows what, it'll be paedophilia eventually. And so it's going. And so what counter-revolutionaries need to do is fight it where it's at and then roll it back from there. Now, I would critique that in several ways, but I kind of see what he's saying. So yeah, I thought this idea from Father Crean was quite an interesting one, and I believe that the average cost of running for a constituency here in Britain, all the administration, everything, not to mention the personal cost from the time invested and so on, but just the financial cost, it's about £10,000. So at the moment, I can't do that. I've got a young family, but if I ever had £10,000 just spare, I can't see it happening. But if it did, I think, trying Father Crean's idea, one general election cycle like we're in at the moment, would be really interesting.
Would it be the Lionheart Party?
Well, I take your suggestion, Connor, but I need to give it more thought.
Well, sure, yeah, but
I like it. I do like it. Yeah, I'd have to give more thought. It would all be about how you frame it, expecting to lose, of course, but the important thing would just be, I think, getting a kind of national recognition that there is something far more integral in resisting the death of England, which everyone feels, every true Englishman feels and knows and grieves. There's a force which is resisting that out there, and maybe then support would flow in. So yeah, just an interesting idea. What do you think about Father Crean's idea?
I like it a lot. My understanding, by poll standards, the death penalty is very popular in England.
Correct. Because the natural law is written on men's hearts, and justice being done to evildoers, that by man's hand, by man shall his blood be spilled, as the Old Testament says, as our Lord says, as God says in the Old Testament. People have a natural sense that heinous crimes should be capital offences, and it's a classic Masonic element of liberalism to remove the death penalty and to replace it with this endless stint in prison. whereas obviously death has a way of focusing the mind so that it's actually much more liable and likely to provoke repentance on the part
Yep.
of the criminal. And of course, any good death penalty would have a priest available for the confession, for them to shrive before meeting their maker. So yeah, that definitely is. I think the death penalty. I think that something like that. Advocating the death penalty for a heinous injustice that everyone sees today and most people hate. I think if that was put forward, it could really catch wind.
The energy that you're sort of talking about that might flow through is more or less being caught up in the Reform Party of today, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's desperate, and not in a good way, because I see Reform as a controlled entity, that it's controlled by the synagogue, that it's essentially a Zionist safety valve operation. I want to disparage too much those who are sort of putting their support and well, I don't think you should put hope in it, but they're doing what they can. But I think it's misplaced. Personally, I think that not voting in the current arrangement is actually possibly better, since the whole rotten system rests on the lie of popular sovereignty, which is a fundamental political error of liberalism condemned by the church. And so what we need to do is, it relies on our consent. So if we withdraw our consent, then that causes a real crisis of legitimacy for the regime, which I think is what we need. Since it's not a true democracy anyway, of course, it's a fig leaf for oligarchy, as was made very clear during COVID. So if we were to wake up on July 5th and voter turnout was at historic lows, was, let's say, even below 50%, it's not going to happen, because unfortunately Reform is galvanizing people to get back involved. But if it was, say, 45%, then I think for the regime, for our enemies, that causes a bigger problem than just, Reform have got 10 MPs or whatever.
Well, would the destruction of the Conservative Party be a valuable victory or no?
Oh, yes. I feel that the strength of that urge.
0 seats.
Yeah, I salt the earth of that party. That party needs to experience Carthaginian levels of destruction, and then the earth needs to be salted, because there's one circle of hell for socialists and revolutionaries in that sense. The lowest circle of hell is for traitors. And we've been talking about the Tory tradition and their betrayal, even of that very problematic political tradition, has been so disgusting in 14 years, what they've done, that I want that party to be annihilated. But I don't think that voting is. I think that voting is still something that would bring on other evils.
And to bring it full circle, they betrayed the Jacobites a long time ago.
Right, exactly. Yes. So we can take it back to 1745, when Bonnie Prince Charlie is in Derby, and he's waiting, and the road to London is clear, and he's waiting to see if the English Jacobites, and particularly the Tories, who are vacillating as always, looking to see which way the wind blows, will rise up in support, with two Hanoverian armies closing in, Cumberland and Wade, and they don't, and so he then retreats back to Scotland, and we know how it ended. That last chance, I think that he should have. I think he wanted to still go on. Of course, Lord George Murray counselled to retreat. I think he should have done, and maybe just like Lionheart might have been rewarded by going for Jerusalem rather than sticking to the coast. Perhaps Bonnie Prince Charlie would have been rewarded, like the first Crusaders were, in taking Jerusalem. So that was a tragic moment. But yes, ever since then, the Tories have been betraying any form of English counter-revolution.
Yeah. So I think that's a great place to end for now. I do think we might have to do an American focused episode, because we didn't really get into the American mess, and it's clear we don't really have the, that would take a while, I think, because it's a lot more complicated in some ways than England. So thank you, Theo, for coming on to talk about this. I really enjoyed this conversation. And anything big coming up on Vendee Radio?
Have a number of interviews planned. I want to do some more episodes. If Alan Phimister, unfortunately, is very busy, but I'd like to do more episodes with Dr. Phimister on the Catholic history of England. And we need to take it forward into the late Middle Ages, which I think is a really important period to look at why God permitted the Protestant Revolution to break out. I'm also looking at releasing some audio recordings of Philip II by William Thomas Walsh, as long as there's no problem with the copyright. It's out of print, and TAN haven't got back to me at all when I asked for permission, so I'm just releasing it anyway. And it's a really great work, which I think offers a lot of lessons actually about what we need to do now in a very pivotal moment in history.
Wonderful. And I just thought about something. Another part for Father Crean's suggestion is that one of the things that would to happen would be that it would force certain media people to either like show who they really are, like if they're supposedly supporting sort of right wing ideas or conservative or traditionalist ideas, would they also support the party that you would put forward, or at least have you on to talk about it, or get an actual swell of support and media attention?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I think is so perceptive about Father Crean's idea, that it's recognizing how important the awful media are and how important media attention is, and the fact that our policy would be so controversial, the fact you'd have so much outraged liberal media could work in our favor. I think it would really galvanize people to see these hysterical revolutionary liberal figures interviewing us and saying, oh, you would say you'd have the death penalty for people offering gender recognition. You say, yeah, and we'd implement it on day one. And to say that with absolutely no fear and with total conviction and no irony or anything else could really, I think, help to speak to people.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and God bless.